Sometimes you just need a medieval nun. No, seriously. Please allow me to introduce Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, a woman who became a nun, who became an author, who became a historian, and who battled her conscience every time she wrote the truth. She's come to be known as the first woman poet and playwright of Germany, the first person since the fall of Rome to write dramas in the West, the most remarkable woman of her time, and the first accepted record of a woman historian. I have no idea if she was salty like this historian. Hrotsvita was born around 935 CE in Saxony. Hers was a noble and influential family, which means she grew up rich and probably spent time at court, meaning with the royals. Usually positions there were filled by the wealthy daughters of wealthy fathers. They got closer to that royalty, and their marriage prospects vastly improved, much to the delight of their fathers. Well, she was rich, so she got an education. The best place to do that was in an abbey. Okay, I concede. She wasn't the kind of nun that you imagined. She was a nun technically, but she and the other women there were never cloistered. Cloistered is how you imagine most nuns. Celibate, poor, and living alone, with a commitment to only God. So the women in the abbey were called abbesses, and usually wealthy, well-educated, and unmarried, and their vows were only temporary. They kept their money and they could come and go as they pleased, until their dads needed a strategic marriage. Ain't it fun to be a bargaining chip? But at the abbeys, women found huge centers of spiritual activity, worship, education, and work. Yeah, there was a focus on religion, but it wasn't the only focus. Abbesses learned beside princesses. Scripture, of course. Hagiography, which is writing about saints in a way that makes them look really good. Liberal arts and classical literature. So in the 10th century CE, the head dude in charge was Emperor Otto. And he was feeling pretty passionate. No, not like that. Okay, maybe like that, but that's not why we're here. He wanted to build libraries throughout his kingdom. Emperordom? Matter. And he wanted to expand the libraries in abbeys. Gandersheim was a royal abbey and prospered. Otto was also not a man who feared a woman with power. In fact, he gave power to the head woman in charge at Gandersheim, Abbess Gerberga. Because of that, she didn't answer to anybody. Well, except for her direct supervisor. Her uncle Otto, the emperor. Well, you ain't gonna believe this. She had the authority to maintain her own court of law, keep her own army, and coin her own money. Significant. Most sources agree that Hrotsvita joined Gandersheim when she was about 21. Others say because of the maturity and depth of her writing. She may actually have joined as a child. Problem is, nobody knows for sure. Much of what historians know about her came from the prefaces she wrote for her own works. Even still, we may never have known any of that, if not for this guy called Conrad Chaltis. In the last years of the 15th century, he was checking shit out at a monastery and happened upon her writing. Among her works were 6 plays, 8 legends, and 2 epic poems, all written in Latin. Her plays are considered the first known Christian dramas. Some say they were performed in her lifetime. Others say, no way, dude, no, didn't happen. But later study seems to prove that they were, like there are literally stage directions in them. She meant for them to be performed. Now, according to the Library of Congress website, her writings were geared toward women. Oh my God, can you believe it? Anyway, until Chaltis, her work had been largely ignored, or maybe intentionally hidden. Either of those is believable, because there was a woman's name on them, which meant that men completely dismissed them. Women weren't an important part of the equation. Ain't history fun? Anyway, Chaltis gathered up everything he could find, translated it, and in 1501 published the first collection of her works. But his preface talked about her literary and patriotic contributions to the German humanist movement, instead of the singularity of her work in that time. In other words, he may have twisted her words a bit to serve his own purpose. Regardless, in the early 20th century, a scholar, a man called Francis Aidan Gasquet, who was made a cardinal in 1914, considered her plays the best of the feudal age. Her writings show a wide knowledge and deep faith in scripture. That's the stuff in the Bible and at church, kids. But she knew a lot of other shit too, like the stuff that men wrote, particularly this guy called Terence. No, I don't give a shit if I said it right. He wrote that women were weak, incapable, morally bankrupt, and easily controlled. Project much, dude? He wrote about men's struggles at court, balancing the temptations of several relationships with several women, usually innocent maidens that they had graped and knocked up, victims that the men's fathers said they had to marry. Would you look at that? They're trying to bring that shit back too. Hrotsvita called bullshit. Okay, not that word. She condemned the social acceptability of women as victims. She echoed Terence's crude language, but wrote that she almost didn't include that. She didn't think evil flattery should be spoken aloud. But she also knew that disregarding it would weaken her message and strengthen his argument that women were weak-minded. She also believed that God meant for her to share it. So she fought her conscience and did as he commanded. Again, using Terence's style, she wrote of virtuous and pure women who placed virginity above all else. They were not the weak damsels in distress. They were powerful. She defended prostitutes. And unlike men who said those women were condemned to eternal flame after they'd made them that way, Hrotsvitha said they could be redeemed if they came to God and renounced all of that came before. They would earn their place in heaven, which further represented women's strength. Because unlike their masculine counterparts, they had conquered immorality. She wrote mainly about martyrs, women who'd been persecuted and unalived by men, who chose torture and unaliving over subjugation to a man's inability to control himself. Those women drew strength from their mothers and their own fervent prayers. While she didn't say outright that gender should be considered, she did suggest that women are the divine connection to God, the center of all life. Yeah, fucking duh. But there's more, because unlike her contemporaries, who focused on local celebrities, I mean saints, brag a little, bring in that tourism, she wrote about anybody from anywhere. She researched tirelessly in the library at Gandersheim, interviewed eyewitnesses, and refuted every dumbass thing Terence wrote. Again, in his style. Unfortunately, she honored the ideals and demands that were placed on women by conceding that Terence was her superior in every way, simply because he had a peener in his pants. Like, why is that even a thing? Not like those little worms can hold a pencil or type, for fuck's sake. Anyway, she acknowledged that learned men praised her work, but disparaged her own talent, education, intelligence, and worth. In other words, she bought into the bullshit, even while she called it out. Her work inspired girls to learn about and write poetry. But while she was alive, she probably never knew how significant she was. A woman, her work didn't carry much weight. Hrotsvitha lived out her life at Gandersheim until she passed away around 973 CE. Today, her works are vitally important to the study of women's history, literature, and early feminism. Some claim her writing was meant to portray the ideal Christian woman, while others say she was writing within the context that she was allowed, to teach integrity and encourage a better opinion of women. Her works are available online if you'd like to read them. Now, before I wrap up, I have a theory, and this shit needs a little salt. Up front, this is my theory, and I haven't found any proof to back it up. But it is worth considering, especially when you notice the patterns throughout history, especially when it comes to women. So Hrotsvitha elevated women's strength. She placed virtue above all else, especially virginity. She elevated women who chose torture and martyrdom over subjugation to men's inability to control themselves. But why? Well, like I said at the beginning, there's evidence she came from a noble family and spent time at court. She wrote about what I told you would happen there. Dudes just threw it in anywhere they wanted, regardless if it was invited. Was one of her eyewitnesses her? She chose complete and permanent celibacy, a life lived mostly away from other people, in pursuit of knowledge over men's pursuit of women. So at least to me, it feels like part of the story is missing. If she was at court, was there a man or men trying to balance her, none of whom would marry her after they had so used her, then justified it by calling her harlot, making her the wicked one, and excusing their own evil? Maybe that's why she defended prostitutes and insisted they could be redeemed if they accepted chastity and the gospel, if they abandoned the life that they lived before coming to the Abbey. Further, while there's no evidence of a child, at least in my limited resources, there's also no proof there wasn't. Maybe she wasn't used by a man, but maybe she delivered a child that her father stole and gave away to save the family's reputation, to prove she was still worthy of a marriage. So she escaped to an abbey instead of being used again. Or maybe she lost a pregnancy, or tried to end one herself, and spent her life atoning, begging for God's forgiveness, by glorifying him and his saints. Yeah, I can't prove it, but we know what we go through, what we've always gone through. Maybe she was just like us, forced to take the only choice they were willing to give her, after they made her feel ashamed for what they did to her.